life, your term show.
We are back with Richard Diaz. Thank you so much for Richard. And Richard, I was just thanking him for coming back here because last time we got cut short. We wanted to get your thoughts on productivity. So I just want to jump in. Where are we going wrong as a country around productivity? Like, how do you frame this? Like, what are your thoughts around productivity in Canada? Can you give us your thinking? I love hearing your take. So
So my thoughts on productivity are very much derived from someone who I think is really the leader, or at least outwardly has been the leader sort of in this discussion, and that's the Deputy Bank of Canada's Governor, Carolyn Rogers. And it's something it was absolutely on my radar. But in fairness, she's got the full force of the Bank of Canada and all the PhD nerds sitting in a dark room in a basement somewhere that can really hash this out and think about it. And so I really rely on her speech, as well as obviously my own views on it and comparisons to other countries, etc. But I think, not to use her as a crutch, but I think I want to elevate her and what she said and not say, I came up with it all. I think that would be bullshit and be disingenuous. And so I'll just start from what she said. The problems in Canada for productivity are, one, the labor mix. We've sort of destroyed what was a very, very good immigration and kind of cocked up our labor mix. The emphasis, I've put the emphasis on, she did not make that emphasis, just to be clear. I don't want to get her in trouble. That was emphasis added by me. She mentioned in her speech from March 2024, competition or lack thereof in key industries. I think that would be very obvious to anybody who's ever tried to buy internet or gasoline or fly or,
cell phone.
Whatever. The other thing she mentioned was a lack of investment. And that's something I've harped on for a long time, just like weak CapEx relative to the number of people in Canada. And so that's like a capital shallowing is like the nerdy way of saying it, which is like a decline in per capita investment. And then I think she mentioned in her speech, that there was sort of, I think she mentioned basically a misallocation to real estate. And that's something I've harped on a lot, which is, because of, that's just basically people chased an economic bubble in housing. And so there was like a misallocation in capital resources. What she didn't mention in the speech, and which is something, again, that I've really, really harped on, is I think that the Bank of Canada and other central banks more generally are also hugely part of the problem. By keeping
Richard, you say it
low for way too long, for extremely loose monetary policy, which created all kinds of perverse incentives. And now, in all fairness, she wasn't going to disparage her own organization.
Of course.
So I get it, but I'll do it for her and say it's fucking the Bank of Canada should not have kept interest rates for as low as they did for as long as they did. And that created all kinds of screwed up incentives, and we're seeing sort of the fruits of their labor. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but what is it? The poison from the tree. Those are the sort of the 3 or 4, maybe 5 different pieces of the productivity puzzle.
Yeah, I joke that a company like ours, Rockstar Real Estate, shouldn't even exist. We're the second order effect of a kind of broken system where Canadians look around thinking, oh my gosh, I can't form pools of capital because any savings I have will get debased so quickly through, whatever inflation rate we want to say is occurring. I need to go put it somewhere. So that in a capitalism market, if we can call this economy capitalism, I don't even know if we can, but if we can, that breaks capitalism because you have people who can't form pools of capital because if they try to save up over a length of time to form that pool of capital to then take a risk by investing it in a productive business of some sort, two things are occurring there that are broken. The first is if it takes you some time, your purchasing power goes down through just the debasement or inflation rate in the country. So then you just look at real estate and you're like, oh, okay, I'll just quickly go buy a rental property of some sort or try to flip a condo or something because that looks like it's going up for all the wrong reasons. And the second thing with that is that a lot of the bigger companies in the country, when they do run into problems, they're bailed out through different mechanisms, like big banks had, and then the central bank keeps the rates for so low. So then you just look around and you're like, well, this, what we have now is just this weird second order effect of a system that we call capitalism. I don't really even know if it is. Like, if we don't let businesses fail that take a risk and make a bad choice, in capitalism, it's supposed to fail. Those businesses are, you take a risk with your capital. If you win, you're rewarded. If you lose, you're supposed to fail. And we didn't let that happen. So we're kind of in this weird economy. And I also kind of point at the central banking system as like, you guys kind of like at the fault of a lot of this stuff. But anyway, here's
your point's really important. So, to recap, there was the labor mix, there's lack of competition, there's the lack of investment, and a couple of, those are the ones, I think the ones that you just added are much too much government. So the crowding out, I think, of and disincentivizing people to take risk through much too higher taxes and regulation, much too high taxes that are too high and regulation. And then again, for people who might, squawk at, another person complaining about regulation, I mean, the data is very clear. The Canadian StatsCan has sort of the regulation per industry over time, and across the board, it's gone up. And the proof is also in the pudding, because we know manufacturing is a small part of our economy right now. Tax take as a percent of GDP is at a 20-year high. Public sector employment is at a 20-year high, or 25-year high at 21.7. Public administration, which is a carve out from the public sector, is like 6 or 7% of total employment, which is another 25 or so year high. So, I mean, the evidence is overwhelming as far as the government's involvement in the economy. And, the truth is, as an analyst, is ultimately what I am, if all of that was coinciding with sort of record productivity growth or improvements in productivity from like a low base or whatever, I would say, okay, I guess we need more government. But the reality is our compound annual growth rate of productivity in Canada is 0.1%. So it might as well be zero, which is incredible. I mean, that is. I didn't
know that was a number. I'm sure you've shared that and I missed it. I didn't know that was a number.
I've shared it on Twitter. I'm happy to share with you the chart again. But like that's a remarkable sort of indictment on the policy choices that have been made, both at an industrial, fiscal, and monetary policy level.
Okay, just hearing you recap all that, like what comes to mind to me is like, how do we shake out of that? Like, it's almost like we're so top heavy with what you just said. I don't understand how you shake out of this. Like, have you just thought, okay, if we pull these levers as a country, as a central bank or as a government, we can kind of change this? Would it be other like weird regulation? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know the answers to all of these problems. I just think what we're doing, we need to stop doing. Like we need to question the taxes. Like people say, everyone always complains about taxes, but when you see the number, like literally the federal tax take as a percentage of GDP bottomed in about 2015 and now is at a 25-year high, perhaps it is not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. You know what I mean? When you see the number of public sector employees dominate the growth in total employment. So from 2019 or 20, I can't remember now. Shit, I'm screwing this up. But like over the last 3 or 4 years, something like 40% of all employment has been in the public sector. Now, okay, people will say, well, Rich, we need, our society is getting older. We need more we need more nurses and doctors, but the healthcare outcomes are worse. The waiting times are worse. Educational outcomes are not as good as they used to be. So there's a misalignment between the idea that you need more money versus what is the outcome that you're getting for that money. The other part that's really important. So like, how do I solve this problem? I don't know. The first thing is sort of addressing those concerns. The other thing is I think there's like incredible amount of low hanging fruit for Canada. But as a philosophy, the people who have been leading our country are not interested in pursuing, in my view, that low hanging fruit. I mean, besides the fact that they've demonstrated that in their language, besides the fact that some of them have written books about it, the legislative record is very, very clear. They're not interested in allowing industry to do its thing. Their view is that the problem for a government screw up is more government. And I'm submitting as someone who believes in a strong welfare state, who believes in relatively free healthcare, or well-funded schools that kids don't have to get into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt into, the answer to our problems is not more government and more taxes. That cannot be the issue, as demonstrated by literally a productivity emergency that we're facing. And so there has to be just a change in philosophy about the role of government and why it's there and who does it benefit and whose job, like who are their masters, it's not like they are our masters. It's not the other way around. And I think that the other thing I think ultimately, that we're dealing with is the other thing that also hurts the productivity emergency is we're dealing with sort of the fallout of a housing bubble. And I think that happens to every country that deals with sort of that massive misallocation of capital. As the tide goes back out, you just have sort of this sort of a collateral damage. And I think that's also a factor, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Jeez. Okay. So what happens when I say this? It's just a lot to think. My mind just goes to where this leads in the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years. And any path I kind of paint forward or I extrapolate forward based on the data that I'm looking at, I'm like, I don't see how this just doesn't really get worse. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm so excited to see the next budget. Like, I'm really excited for this budget because it's going to be a horror show. They should just release it on Halloween. Just put it on Halloween. Say, hey, this is going to be a horror show. But I can't wait to see these numbers, because in the real estate market, we look around and we can see kind of like on the streets what's happening in the real estate market. And that's a big percentage of the Canadian economy, rightly or wrongly, as we've been discussing. But if that is as affected as I think it is, I just don't know where this budget kind of comes in. So then the next few years just to me means, they're going to just print more money to paper over that. And like, it just seems like we're on this path, and I don't know where it just leads. It's confusing. And then as an investor,
there's a political angle to all of this, which is the people who voted for this current administration fundamentally are not impacted by all the negative things that have been happening, right? Like, sorry, that wasn't very articulate. Meaning,
that's fair. Yeah.
The older people who listen, overwhelmingly, it was a tight election, but when you cut it up by demographic, the people over the age of 65 fundamentally were scared off by the boogeyman of Donald Trump. Let's just call it what it is. Mm-hmm. And the trolling of him, invading Canada, which is absurd. Mm-hmm. It is absurd. We need to call it out. We share a 4,000 kilometer unguarded border with the largest military empire that's ever known. It was a fantasy that was amplified by a media that ultimately knows who its paymaster is. Let's just be very transparent about that. What's frustrating for me is that those baby boomers ultimately are not impacted by the housing crisis. They already own their homes. They're not impacted by the educational crisis. They're not, the immigration crisis that has affected young people, especially. They're not in. That doesn't impact them. And so, what I think you need ultimately, I know people are not going to like this, is for more pain. You need more pain, because that is the only way people will recognize that the path they're on has demonstrably been the wrong one, but now it's affecting them, really. And I think the next election, when it comes, I think that the distraction that was Donald Trump, I think will fall flat, because people will have, it's like a one shot. I think it's a one shot.
Yeah, like the boogeyman was already played. That card was already played. Yeah.
And this idea that Canada is going to pivot wholesale to Europe, it's a fantasy. When it comes to trade, proximity, and in Canada's case, pipelines matter. Canada's 400,000 kilometers with a pipeline with the United States. 400,000 north-south pipelines with the United States. We export 93% of our oil, which is 30% of our total exports. We can't even do interprovincial trade properly. And we think we're going to somehow pivot our entire economy to selling what to Europe? They're not going to receive our agricultural products. Their agricultural lobby is as strong as anybody's in the world. Apparently, they no longer want to consume oil, which is, of course, bullshit. Mm-hmm. So, and so I just think, and more importantly, just in general, European economy is flatlining. Germany's in a recession. The UK is in a world of hurt. France's budget woes are worse than virtually any rich countries in the world. You know, Italy's population is shrinking. Who knows what Spain is too small, really, although Spain's doing okay, it's really too small. So I just described to you something like 80% of the EU GDP, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. And all the rest of the periphery are frankly not that important. So we've got two customers, Asia. What does Asia want? Asia wants our natural resources and maybe a few little esoteric manufactured goods. And then we have the United States. And so Canada has to make a choice. How, instead of saying we're going to end the relationship with America because they said some mean things and put pressure on us when we didn't like it, we have to be honest about sort of what we want for the future of Canada. And I think sovereignty is probably the single most important thing. And how do you really achieve sovereignty? You achieve sovereignty by sort of replicating what John A. Macdonald did in the 1860s. Which is by linking Canada ever closer together. So in the 1860s, America was saber rattling around, invading Canada, and so the deal that John A. Macdonald made with the British Columbia, which was a British colony at the time, was if we build a cross-country railway system, will you join this new country called Canada? British Columbians said yes. John A. Macdonald built the railway, and two disparate colonies became one. And Canada has another opportunity. And in effect, history is very much repeating, where we've got this boogeyman who's threatening, quote unquote, threatening the sovereignty of Canada. And we have an opportunity, to me, that's very, very obvious. And that's to further stitch west to east. And east to west via pipeline. And I don't just mean one pipeline. I mean the suite of pipelines that you would need for a sovereign, independent, and energy secure nation, which is natural gas and crude oil and the refineries and all those stuff.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, and the refineries, yeah.
Because people talk about bringing manufacturing just as a silly example, right? Like this current government wants to raise defense spending from 1% of GDP to 5 or something, right? It's like 1.5 of like squishy stuff, and then like 3.5 like proper guns and bullets and things. And in order to do that, they want to have a procurement that's domestic, right? They want to increase the domestic procurement of those, let's say, defense things from Canada. But we can't. That's literally it's a fantasy, because we don't manufacture enough goods to meet even the most basic of that sort of new demand. And part of the manufacturing is having access to relatively stable and cheap energy. Guess what? Canada has certain infinite amount of cheap and relatively stable energy. And I don't, by the way, I'm not just saying that natural gas is the be all end all, but building nuclear power plants, et cetera. I mean, how are we going to process all these rare earth minerals that apparently are, our neighbors and allies want? You need massive amounts of energy to do that. It's extremely, extremely energy intensive to process rare earth and critical minerals. And so ultimately, it's really the energy industry that I think is really the forefront of how Canada can become a more stable and sovereign nation that is not as dependent on the United States. And that's the irony. The irony is just profound, right? Like, that's the ticket is that it's not just digging. It's not just crude oil and oil sand. It's like the suite of capacity that we have on offer that we just insist really on ignoring.
Hey everyone, before we dive back into the podcast, I've got a quick shout out about the Your Life, Your Terms report. This is Tom's weekly newsletter where he and Nick share real stories, experiences, and powerful insights to help you live life on your terms. Each week, Tom breaks down the economy, real estate, macro trends, and Bitcoin, and gives you actionable steps to make these insights work for you. No fluff, no vague predictions, just a clear path to thriving no matter what's going on in the world. Tens of thousands of Canadians are already getting the real information they need to level up their lives every week. I can honestly say it's the only newsletter that I've stayed subscribed to for years. It delivers real value that keeps me coming back for more. Join us and start getting the insights and tools to create the life you want, plus entertaining and inspiring stories from Tom and Nick along the way. Sign up for free at rockstarinnercircle.com/get-started and start living life on your terms. That's rockstarinnercircle.com/get-started. your first step to living life on your terms.
Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit because, we could go on about that. I think you're just hitting the nail on the head with it all. But I had someone ask me; they wanted me to ask you what do you use as your personal inflation rate? And before you answer, I want to share two things with you. I want to share something that we look at a lot, and I know
I'm laughing because we talked about this offline. So
yeah, I know. Yeah, we did. I always look at M2 and I'm like, since 1969 from Stats Canada, or the data I can pull, Government of Canada data, Stats Canada, whoever I'm pulling it from, is it's about 8% or so compounded annually forever. And then the other way I look at it is I'm like, okay, maybe I'm looking at this, incorrectly. And if I go to the Institute of International Finance, I can see that the global debt is like $337 trillion, which is about like 3 to 1. Depends which way you round, but it's like 3 to 1 debt to GDP globally. And then my mind just plays like simple math. And I'm like, if there's $3 of debt for every dollar of GDP in the world, and the GDP pays for the debt, right? If the average interest rate on the debt is, let's say, 3%. I think I'm being generous. Maybe it's 4%, but I think I'm being very generous at 3%. So then, okay. So on the 3 to 1 ratio, if the interest rate on the 3 is 3%, well, for the GDP, which is 1, because the ratio is 3 to 1, and if the 3 is growing at 3%, the GDP kind of has to sort of grow at like 9%. 3 times 3, like it's got to grow 3 times faster to be able to cover the debt payments, because hear me out, because the debt is sucking cash out of the GDP for debt payments.
Careful now.
GDP, no, this is what I want you to talk about. And so if the GDP is a 3 to 1 ratio, the debt is growing at 3%. Well, the GDP has to kind of grow at like 9% to even have a chance. Otherwise, the debt is so big, it sucks so much cash out of the GDP that the GDP is actually going to shrink. So we must have 9% inflation. Like at a minimum, we must globally just print money and throw it around, which becomes then my family's hurdle rate to invest in anything. I have to beat 8 or 9% at a minimum every year to stay ahead financially in this world. So you can rip now. I'm not ripping. I think what's important to understand, however, is that we've been in a 40-year cycle of declining interest rates. Meaning that sort of debt servicing that you described, which is the 3 times 3 or what have you, has been declining. And only now, after the first time really since 1982, is debt servicing starting to rise. And so you could make the case that it's been declining, but the debt was a lot less 20, 30 years ago. Right.
But what I'm saying to you is debt, fine. But then, so then add on debt to GDP has been rising. So your scenario makes sense if, in my view, again, it's tough to do math sort of off the cuff, but your situation makes sense if debt to GDP in 1982 was 300% and now it's 300%. But we haven't been servicing that debt. That's the point. The debt's been rising. We haven't been paying down that debt. I mean, but I think that this, in the sense that we're sort of getting in the weeds. I mean, the real question you had is like, Richard, how do you define?
I like getting in the weeds, Richard. Getting in the weeds.
I don't want to. I feel like it's not as exciting talking about navel gazing over math. I think what's more interesting is your real question and challenging me on how do I define inflation.
Absolutely.
I want to make it clear to people. I get this on Twitter. I say when inflation. Remember during the pandemic, inflation was like 8 or 9% or 6 or whatever percent, and everybody was like, it's way too low. I'm like, I know. I know that CPI is not some like perfect model or whatever for inflation. I don't think any like economist sits at night and reads the CPI report and I think this is the unvarnished word of God. No. That is what it is number one, these things are difficult to calculate. And I think that because of things like productivity and the change in your basket. And so I would challenge people to do what you've done, which is to sort of think of proxies. And that's ultimately what you're trying to do. You're trying to think of something, you're trying to think in laterally and saying, okay, we know that the CPI is flawed. So what is a different way of sort of calculating the hurdle rate to sort of keep my head above water in a world of basically, constant debasement? And from that perspective, I totally get it. What I think that often people miss is, number one, it's super, super hard to do that. And if it was easy, someone else would have already come up with that. And the other thing I would sort of also challenge is that, often it's not so much the level that matters, it's the direction and pace that it is often, that people often forget.
Like the velocity of the increases year over year, kind of.
Right. And then the direction. So where it's going, when it's spiking, it's much more painful than when it's coming down. And the other thing that I would challenge, the other thing that I think people need to sort of recognize, the third piece, again, in defense of things like CPI, is that people are much, much more sensitive to pain than they are to happiness. So, you don't like cars today. Yes,
but we never get that. We never get the happiness because prices never really come down.
But I mean,
the inflation rate might come down, but the price of anything I need, like the steak, that I buy, it doesn't come down.
Don't use steak as an example. That's
okay. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I like to eat. That's what I like to eat. But the government of Canada says buy hot dogs.
Let's use flat screen TVs. Everybody has.
I don't want to use flat screen TVs because it's going to prove your.
What's my point?
Sure, it proves your point that we've gotten more productive at creating flat screen.
You're missing the quality piece.
The quality, but I can't eat quality.
Oh, come on. Of course you can. You eat quality all the time. I mean, the fact that in the way that things have improved in a substantial way, for example, how long goods stay on the shelf. I mean, the vast, it's not all doom and gloom. This is my point. I think people are much, much more sensitive to negatives. I broke up with a girlfriend a couple of years ago. I spent the last 3 years thinking about how much of a heartbreak that has been, to a degree, that's fair and natural and normal. Yeah. But I've also should have spent lots of time thinking about all the wonderful times we had. But, that's why psychologists exist. No one's ever going to have a podcast talking about how great everything is and how well and accurate. You know what I'm saying? Like that you have to allow for the fact that humans massively discount quality improvements.
But I think I can defend anyone making that misallocation maybe in their budget when they're thinking about things, because I still need a TV. So when I go to Best Buy to buy the TV, I'm still spending whatever it is, $1,000. Sure, I got 50 inches now for $1,000 instead of 42.
It's an inch thick. Come on.
It's an inch thick. But I mean, in my life, rent hasn't gone down. Groceries haven't gone down. Like I went to Metro recently and I couldn't believe, I'm staring at the bill like in absolute disbelief. 2 customers around me are talking about the bill. The lady helping me at the self-checkout was talking about how expensive stuff is. Their family is coming over for some lamb and she couldn't afford the lamb. And so I love it when people use that, because you're not the first to tell me about like phones and TV. I'm like, guys, it doesn't affect the average Canadian's bottom line. So yeah, as an economist, I could see. Yeah, but I think it is like the iPhone's $2,000.
Yeah, but
like the new iPhone's but it doesn't matter. It's still $2,000.
But I'm not okay. Let's step back. I'm not disagreeing with you in the sense that inflation has been out of control and it's directly a result of government debasement with the help of central banks. Full stop. I'll also agree with you unequivocally that it's way higher than the 3%. Or that we're seeing right now.
Okay.
I think that 100%. I think your point more generally is how do I benchmark it? And I think that you're right about the closer to 6 or 7 or even 10% rather than the 2 that we've seen. So I agree with you on full stop. My point is more generally that outside of the part that you're right, I think the part that we just as humans discount full is the degree to which the quality piece is not at all. We don't get it because we take it for granted.
Yeah. Yep. Like how much? Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like I understand it. Yes. Yeah.
We just take it for granted. We take it for granted that we take computers for granted. Which is like my 95% of my waking day is staring at a computer screen. So you can't just yada, yada, yada computers. It's like the single most important thing that I use in my day-to-day life. And it is.
I didn't yada the computer. I didn't. Yeah. I get what you're saying. Yeah. I see what
your
you're
point
saying.
is right. But your point more broadly, I don't want to distract from the point that you made, which is, I think, an excellent one, which is there's something obviously wrong with the CPI. We are not, it is not appropriately capturing what has gone on. And one way to think about it, just one quickly, is the house prices.
No. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
house price. House prices have been up like 20% every single year, and it's not included in the consumer basket. But housing is the lion's share, or excuse me, the biggest single item in anyone's outgoings every month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. That's the greatest example to me is house prices. And I guess, the way I sometimes look, another way I break it down, and I think you've heard me say this before, but I'd like to get your fresh thoughts on this, is sometimes I'm like, okay, the three biggest factors that I think will have influence on the GDP would be labor, productivity, and capital/debt, however you're looking at like capital and our debt-based money system, those three things. So the labor force participation rate in the West generally seems to be on the decline. Definitely in the US. I don't have like labor force participation stuff for Canada, but we seem to mirror the US. Okay. Thank you. And then productivity, to me, aside from investing in the right things that would be productive enterprises in the country, I just mean we're getting more productive at doing stuff. Like, I used to run a digital camera website and we sold digital cameras. I used to get little commissions from all these like little vendors. Now the digital camera is just like in the phone. So like this whole industry of digital cameras is just kind of like those jobs are just gone. Right.
They've been allocated. They've been reallocated.
Sure. But some of them, yes, reallocated. Yeah. You're a much nicer guy. See, when you say it like that, you're just such a nice person.
It's true.
You're a good guy. Whereas I just say they're gone forever.
No, but that's not fair, right? That's like not a fair characterization. Those jobs didn't disappear. They've moved people.
Well, no, they did. They did disappear. They disappeared.
But so did
But I know somebody got employed somewhere else. Like I get it.
Right.
I get what you're saying. But when you do productivity enhancements across like movies, long distance phone lines, eliminated Bell Canada, Bell Mobility kind of saved them, like taxis with Uber, like you have so many of these changes. I don't know if we can account for one replacement on that. And I just feel like if productivity in one industry like TVs or computers can be so good that we're getting so much more for so much less, why hasn't that shown itself in all these other areas like building houses? And I just feel
that's
like
a fascinating question. I think that's a really interesting and fascinating question.
And to me, that's kind of like the whole crux of the issue, that I think it's just the system and the way we're looking at it and trying to measure it. It's like we can't, because we must have GDP go up. Like we're in a system where GDP must increase.
GDP per capita must increase.
Well, okay, I'm just using it as an absolute number, because if it doesn't
that's
increase,
very important. Because, sorry to interrupt. Sorry to cut you off.
No, please do. Yeah.
The whole problem with Canada over the last 10 years is we've had GDP go up, but the GDP per person has been flat to down. So the reason, this is like,
you're just saying like go ahead. Sorry, keep going.
So the productive, this is what I mean. So another way of thinking about productivity is how much production an economy produces per person. This is what's so infuriating about the apologists for people like me who say, hey, GDP per capita is flat on a 10-year basis. That's horrible. And people say, growth is really good. It doesn't matter.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yes. Yeah.
If you literally, let's say your GDP is 1 because you have one person. And then you literally add a new warm body and your GDP is still 1. You're not better off. You're actually much worse off. And so what the Liberal Party has trying to convince everybody is like, but the number's 2. It's like, yeah, but there's 2. There's like, we get less. Yeah. And so that is fundamental.
Got it. Okay. I see what you're saying. I see. I was using it from a different angle. I got what you're saying.
You've raised a really, really good, important point, because when I was studying economics, 20 years ago, the real emphasis on economics was not all this woke climate change bullshit. It was in developmental economics was the hot thing. Make poor countries richer. And why not richer like cash money, like, bling richer? I mean, like wealthier. Like, how do you improve the livelihoods, the human development index of third world countries? And the emphasis was you improve per capita GDP, meaning each quote unquote individual is more productive. And then with that productivity growth, you can then allocate those extra resources to hospitals, to food, to healthcare, which would then increase healthcare outcomes, which makes people more productive, which is ideally like a virtuous circle. And so this is what you're describing, what we're all sort of feeling, I think, really, is the fact that Canada's per capita GDP has not risen in 10 years. And so you're seeing, and so that means that you're not seeing, quote unquote, these gains in productivity because there are none, which is actually what you described.
And I think what I'm saying is that, to your point on productivity, this GDP is not rising because capital is being misallocated, as we discussed earlier, but also the productivity is getting so good in the economy, not productive capital in the right places. The productivity of just technology is now becoming a downward force.
I can't.
I know you disagree on this. And to me, it's just becoming a downward force. So what's happening is it's going to be very, very hard.
It's not true. Rob, Tom, you can't say that. Productivity is not a downward force.
I'm curious. Yeah. Tell me.
Because productivity means like penicillin is an improvement in productivity. Indoor plumbing is an improvement in productivity. The internet is an improvement in productivity. Polyester is an improvement in productivity. I mean,
but so was a calculator that I used to. So was a calculator that I used to buy that now is free on my phone.
But that's an improvement in productivity. That doesn't make things worse for you. That doesn't bring
GDP comes down. But GDP comes down. I don't have to buy the calculator.
No, that's not true. That's just not true. Because what it does, like from a theoretical standpoint, it creates a surplus so you used to spend $5 on a calculator, and then you don't now. So you have an extra $5. This is my
point. Now we're talking my point. Yes, exactly.
So what do you do? That $5, you don't light that $5 on fire.
So your thinking is that I would allocate that to something else immediately. And my thinking is that, well, no, just in that moment, freeze the GDP count right there, and there's $5 that has been not spent.
But in practice, that's just not empirically. That's not what happened.
Okay. I see where you're coming from now. I see where you're coming from. I think I disagree with that. I see where you're coming from, though.
But let me give you a more tangible example. 100 years ago, we used to spend 50% of the people. Let's say maybe 200 years ago, for example. I'm trying to think of round numbers. Let's say 100 years ago, people used to spend something like 50 or 60% of their entire income on food. Now it's 8%. 11%, 12%, whatever. In a poor country, maybe it's 30.
I feel like it's 30. I feel like it's 30%, but sure.
No, it's just not. It's just not. So again, it's a sticker. This is the thing. There's a perception versus reality thing. You feel the food inflation because you buy the food constantly. You're constantly reminded that steak is going up. You're not constantly reminded that your car is going up. You buy a car once every 5 years. It's impossible that you have the same feedback loop with your psychological understanding of spending. I literally the reason I notice my steak is going up and up and up because I literally buy it every week. Cars you buy once every 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So you cannot, it is in my view, it is almost impossible to compare the feedback loop that you have with buying your steak, which drives you crazy because it's constantly going up, versus the quality improvements in a car today versus 10 years ago that you buy.
So then what would be the economic analyst answer to why is the steak going up? Because everything is getting better. Computers, we just decided, are getting better. Cars are getting better. I would think logistics are getting better. I would think the ability to feed the cattle herd is getting better. So every step along everything along the supply chain.
I don't know why steaks are more expensive. I'd be lying to you if I knew why.
No, but I mean, to me, that kind of proves that we can't figure this out from this kind of mess that we're in. Is that the things that we need are just more expensive. Shelter, rent, housing, groceries, they're all more expensive.
Yeah. I mean,
I understand the productivity, like you said, the shelf life and all these.
There's two separate things here. One is we are suffering right now an acute increase in prices across the board, which is why I hate the Bank of Canada for cutting interest rates, why I think it's irresponsible for the Canadian government to run such a massive budget deficit. I agree with you full stop on all of that. The part that I objected to you about, which is this idea that productivity is improvements in productivity are bad. That's crazy, man. I'm sorry.
No, they're good. They're good. It makes everything. No, they're amazing. It makes everything cheaper. It makes I'm saying they're so good. It makes everything cheaper. Like I don't have to. I can watch the movie now at home. I don't spend the gas to go to the movie theater. I don't buy the popcorn. I don't buy anything there. I go. So that's
allocated to something else, though.
Okay, I see what you're saying, but I just don't, in my mind, I'm like, no, I don't, like that day that I was going to go to the movies, I didn't add up what I was going to, I know what you're saying, like that's silly, the way, how am I going to explain this, but I don't add up what I was going to spend on gas and popcorn and maybe even a dinner afterwards and then allocate that somewhere else. I just did not spend that money. I was going to go to the dinner that you said I was going to spend the money on, and I was going to go spend it anyway. I was going to do that anyway before I got the movie for so cheap. Like to me,
I see your point though.
That theory doesn't hold. Like it's like
no.
I was going to do these things, so I'm just spending less in the economy. I want to move on to some others.
It's compelling. It's a really interesting argument. I get what you're trying to say, but I think it reminds me of sort of the broken window fallacy, which is if you want to improve your economy, you should go around and break all these windows because then people will be paid to repair those windows. But we know that that's not true. We know if we did, because those people wouldn't just be sitting at home, like those window repairmen don't just sit around. They'd be like, oh, I will just go and build a new house and put new windows into a new house. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do. Yeah.
Because that's like, it's really interesting. That's actually really, really interesting. Like it's kind of the reverse broken window fallacy. Because by that logic, you should just never leave the house ever, and you would be extremely productive.
No, but I'm still going to go do things. It's just that I'm saving all this money elsewhere, but I don't immediately reallocate the funds. It's like
but you do though. You do.
I know what you're saying, but. And I'm sure some families there are thinking, well, I still spend 100% of my budget every month. So they're like, absolutely, I do. And I just think there's a different element at play here. Like, I think the reason the steak is more expensive is that because it's more scarce than M2. And we are printing more and more money as the money supply increases, the debasement continues. So there's more and more dollars required for the more scarce thing, the steak.
I agree with that.
And it's literally that simple. And so to me, that's like the whole thing. It's like, debasement to me is the ultimate answer of it all.
I'm very sympathetic to that view. I think that there's something when you're watching the gold price skyrocket, Bitcoin, I did notice that
you put Bitcoin on a chart. Yeah. Maybe that was I did notice that. I might have mentioned that.
Maybe that's a contrarian indicator. Maybe that's your sign to warning to not financial advice. That's
the top. Richard Diaz put a Bitcoin.
But I think your point about debasement, I think is listen. I don't think any sensible person can tell you that we're not going through some kind of really screwed up financial situation.
Sure.
The government, again, to bring it all sort of together, why you and I really sort of, in a weird way, we actually see a really, really eye to eye on this is because productivity, the way I see it, has collapsed. And one way that you can sort of absorb that extra debasement is by increasing productivity. So so for example, if prices of everything are going up, but you're wealthier, right? If prices by milk go up by 10%, but you're getting 10% more wages, it doesn't really matter what the price of the milk is. You're wealthier personally. And at the end of the day, you're basically lockstep. Mm-hmm. Right. But what we're witnessing, as you described, is the price of milk is 10%, but our wages aren't keeping up. Mm-hmm. And steak is up by 20 or 30%, and our wages aren't keeping up. And so that delta is what we're really feeling. And that's why there's so much angst in Canada. That's why, we're feeling what we're feeling. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter what the quote unquote price is. What matters is how is it relative to our income? Because tomorrow, absolutely, right, because that's really what we're describing, and I think that's where you and I really connect. Because I agree with you completely. We are suffering a debasement. You can see it everywhere.
Well, and I love chatting with you because you'll entertain you'll entertain just my own thinking, and I don't get the opportunity to bounce some of these crazy thoughts but I think you're off people. So I like the fact that you're willing to entertain this. So thank you, Richard.
But the mistake that people like me make is that we think that we have it all figured out, and I think that if I've learned anything in this business is that, man, I've been wrong about some freaking howlers, man. I've just been like,
sure.
And so you have to be, and I will be wrong again. Right now I'm having a pretty decent streak, but the streak might end, as soon as tomorrow. And so you have to be gentle with other people's views, because not only do they help you sort of triangulate your own thoughts, but you just can't live in a world where you're never wrong. It's just not, that's not life.
No, no. And I think that's what we all appreciate about you. You just call it as you see it, and you're willing to say, hey, maybe I made a mistake on that area. Do you have a few? I want to get your thoughts on one of your latest charts that you put out on X. I just want to share that. I don't generally share my screen like this, but I think I can do it. I just want to share.
Close all your
No, I think I can just share this. I think this actually works. So what you should see on the screen is your post where you talk about Canadian government bond yield curve. The Bank of Canada cuts have not provided that much mortgage relief. Do you see that chart?
Yeah,
my screen's
though. I think it'll make it better.
There. Yeah. Can you see it? You can still see it?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you see this, can you just, because I think we're getting a lot of questions here about this. So what is going on? The Bank of Canada cut rates a little bit, but you're posting about the yield curve and making these comments. Can you just describe for anyone listening, what's happening in the world right now with mortgage rates? Why are they behaving the way they are?
Sure. Okay. So the first thing everyone, I think when they're looking at this chart, they need to sort of understand what the word yield curve, and that's like a wonky kind of annoying way of describing interest rates at different maturities. Okay. So that's what you can see on the Y scale. On the left-hand side, you can see the yield. So that's the quote unquote interest rate, let's just say. And on the bottom is the years to maturity, which sort of makes sense. If you think about it, you have a 1-year bond yield, it'll be one thing. You have a 2-year bond yield, whatever. And so you can do it. And each maturity on the yield curve has a different sort of absorbs and reflects different investor appetite and economic phenomena, for lack of a better word. So at the front end of the yield curve, also known the short end of the yield curve, it is basically a pure play on the Bank of Canada's interest rate policy. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit fast and loose with these terms, because this is obviously not a finance course, but just bear with me. So for the people who know more, don't fucking write comment. Front end of the yield curve is, in effect, reflects and absorbs interest rate policy. So at the most front of the frontiest front, at the shortest part of the yield curve would be the overnight target rate set by the Bank of Canada. Makes sense, right? We just saw them cut it to whatever it is now, 250, I forget the number. And at the long end of the curve, so 10, 15, 20 years out, you have different things that are sort of, again, absorbed and then reflected in the preferences investors will pay for the bond, which is the inverse of the yield. Okay. So you have things like inflation. Makes sense. If there's lots of inflation, you don't want to own a fixed income asset. If there's lots and lots of growth, your preference will be to own a different asset than, again, a fixed income asset. There's things like a term premium, which is also included, which means if I'm going to lend you $5 and you're meant to pay me back tomorrow, I might only charge you a little bit of interest. If you're only going to pay me back in 3 or 4 years, the presumption is you're going to pay me even more interest than you would if it was just a day loan. That makes sense. If that's in our world, if you want to be a nerd about it, you call that a term premium, which makes sense. You have a premium that you pay for extra term. So we have growth, we have inflation, we have a term premium, and then in some cases you have something called a credit spread. So if you're a better or worse credit than your neighbor, then you're, as a borrower, you'd have to pay a higher credit spread. That makes sense. There's other shit involved, but basically those 4 things at the long end, and then there's the Bank of Canada's interest rate policy at the uber short end. And what this chart shows you is the red line, which is, as you can see, where interest rates were last year. And you can see that the red line at T0, which is basically the T 1 month, was saying what the Central Bank of Canada's overnight rate is. And what it shows you is, even though there was loads and loads of cuts, right? I think it was like 200 basis points of cuts over the last 18 months, whatever it is. And that's what that dark blue line shows you at the front end. It actually didn't really change where mortgage rates are priced, which is in between, let's say, this is now in your world, so you correct me if I'm wrong, let's say between 3-ish and 5-ish years. I just use 5 as a proxy because it's just easier to range. But you get the idea. And so what's fascinating is like all these people who are clamoring for cuts from the Bank of Canada, what this demonstrates is actually there wasn't much movement in that quote unquote mortgage proxy. Now, people will say, Richard, there's other types of mortgages. There's variable rate mortgages. There's 2-year. I get it. Okay. But just to try to keep things simple. And that's because, the bond market was sniffing out the movement of the Bank of Canada. And it also was sniffing out things like inflation and growth and term premium and other stuff. And so this is what my point also going forward, which is I think really the crux of the conversation is.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not clear that ever more rate cuts will provide relief in the mortgage market. And that's because of things like, as you've demonstrated, there's clearly way more inflation than is demonstrated by either A, the CPI, or B, the Bank of Canada talks about. There's worries about credit quality. Canada, I think, is a rich country. It can withstand lots of crises, but there's obviously a growing worry about our fiscal path, as demonstrated by the PBO last week. They literally said our path is unsustainable. There's obviously
wasn't that wild? That was wild. Sorry, I don't want to throw you out. That was wild. But anyway,
to make a long story very, very short, and so that mortgage, and then also then there's the credit spread. So banks, let's say you're some random bank, you're seeing unemployment rise. You're seeing uncertainty with respect to tariffs and trade. You're seeing growth slow. If someone comes to you and says, I want $1 million mortgage, before you might have given them a discount on that government bond yield. You're just like, oh, everything's going great. This person's borrowing $1 million. They're definitely going to pay me back. I'm going to give them a 20 basis point discount. Now you're saying, oh, I'm actually worried this person might lose a job. Obviously, this is an extreme example, but you get it.
Sure.
And I'm actually going to charge a 1% premium on that 5-year government bond, right? And so those are all those things that are like sort of piling up such that the mortgage rate at the 5-year hasn't really, it's come down a smidge, I get it, but that's what I'm saying. And so, when you hear people clamoring for more rate cuts, it's like, it's all well and good, but it's just
not that easy.
It's a very specific part of the curve. And that's why you call it the yield curve. It literally just looks like a curve, convex, concave curve. Anyway, so that's why I think it's really interesting. And the reason I publish that kind of stuff is because I think it really sort of, for me personally, I just think it's cool. I'm a nerd. But for people who are, for the layman, I think it's like important to realize that like you might read an article or CBC or CT News headline that says, oh, the Bank of Canada cuts rates. And then then you go to the bank and you say, hey, wait a second. Why isn't that being reflected in my mortgage?
In a 5-year mortgage.
And that's the reason. It's because those two are those are separate things and separate phenomena.
Okay, so it makes perfect sense. So absolutely. So basically the bond market kind of sniffs out like all these other concerns or things in the economy. And it's like, oh, we don't really care that the Bank of Canada cut rates. Here's what we're willing to here's the rate of that the market is saying this debt is going to go out the door at. So, it's like the market's deciding, I guess, and you did a great job with that chart. So thank you. That's definitely a complicated subject. And I guess what I wanted to ask you next is that if we see a Canadian budget with like a deficit like larger than we could even imagine, do you think the bond market starts saying, whoa, like this, all of this Canadian debt here, like this, it's going to have to be a much higher interest rate for the market to be interested in buying any of this stuff. And in that case, how close would we be to a country like Canada doing something like yield curve control, where it says, okay, like we just can't have that. That'll just like make our books crazy. If the interest rates goes up too high, we're just going to have to step in and do it in whatever their mechanisms they'll do it, but ultimately print some money and, buy some debt. Like how close are we closer to yield curve control in a G7 country like Canada? Or like, what do you think when I say that?
I think you've really nailed it. I think as investors, because ultimately that's what this is all about for us personally at IceCap, this is like one of our effectively base cases. Like we think...
Okay. I think you said that before and I had forgotten. Yeah.
So we think that like we think that the probability of this happening is very high. Will it happen? Who knows?
And what time frame are you using when you say that as a ballpark? Because I know you don't have the crystal ball.
Within a couple of years. I mean, it'll either happen relatively quickly or it won't happen at all. And in the sense that, like,
God,
that's like a bit unfair. I'm like sort of, couching it. But the reason,
but I mean, you kind of have to.
But what people need to understand is yields or interest rates are a function of price. And right, it's when you have 5% on 100, that's, and then, your yield and your price are inversely correlated. So as price goes down, yield goes up, and as yield goes down, price goes up.
So in layman terms out there, if everyone in the world said, I'm selling Canadian debt because I don't like the fiscal situation of this country, and they just sold, all of a sudden the rate on that debt would increase.
Right.
So, and it would reflect a higher borrowing cost for all of us in our everyday lives.
Right. And it makes sense, right? If you think of bonds, right? So it's just supply and demand. So you've demonstrated sort of a buyer's strike, let's just say, for argument's sake, which is everyone wants to sell Canadian bonds. But there's another way that you might increase supply is if you issue loads and loads of bonds.
Yeah. I got it. Exactly.
But your point is the corollary to mine. They belong together. You were demonstrating a reduction in demand, and I was just simply articulating an increase in supply. But ultimately, they are the same, which is if we walk into a situation, let's say just for argument's sake, the budget deficit was like $300 billion. Okay, it's not going to be that, but let's just say they would be issuing an enormous amount of paper, that's just fancy way for saying they would increase the supply of the bond. More supply, price goes down, yields go up. And that's basically it. And so this is also why, there's some politicians out there who blame the government for higher yields. And I know I get it's a lot of political, circle jerking, but I get it. But it's also, he has a point, right? Like if governments run massive budget deficits, it puts pressure on different parts of the yield curve. I hope I didn't confuse.
No, you did. You're just making it like you're just saying the fact that it's even a case that you're considering could happen in a country like Canada is kind of pretty stunning just to hear.
I don't think we're going to have a $300 billion budget deficit. I was just making an extreme.
No. I don't mean that. I mean the fact that yield curve control could be something that actually happens.
Let's rewind. So let's get to that. So we have a situation now where interest payments from the federal government are already as high or higher than health care transfers, which is nuts, right? But let's just say, for argument's sake, it's 50 and 50.
I don't think I knew that about Canada. Holy shit.
Totally nuts. So we're paying as much on interest on the debt, not even paying back the debt, just interest that people, if you're listening, you obviously know that, sorry, as healthcare payments. But the problem is the global yield curve is rising because of a number of factors, but let's just leave that aside. And so Canada's sort of getting pushed up with this. And so our interest payments on this debt are rising. And obviously we're about to issue way more debt. Plus we're going to roll over the 500 or so billion that's owed, that's coming up for redemption in 2025 and 2026. That rolled over debt, it will be at a higher interest rate, just as a function of math. And we're issuing more paper at higher interest rates. And so it's almost a virtual certainty that interest payments in absolute terms will rise from 50 to whatever, 60 or 70, whatever. And so that's so the problem, the Bank of Canada sits around and goes, oh, we're supposed to be independent. I'm laughing because they're obviously not independent.
Yeah.
And they get a call from Mark Carney and goes, Mark Carney goes, please bail us out.
Who used to work there? So he knows exactly who to call.
I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression. The Bank of Canada is independent, allegedly.
I'll give everybody the wrong impression. You don't. Anyway, I will.
Okay. Yeah, fine. I don't want to get in trouble. But so what they might think is their rationale will be what happened in COVID, which is we need to step in basically and control the interest rate by printing money. Yes, CBC printing, not with some guy in a basement and paper and ink. It's just a couple taps on a keyboard and you basically poof money into existence, because that's the system we have. And in order to basically absorb that extra issuance that otherwise wouldn't be absorbed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so
and
your point about yield,
because then that all just trickles into my M2 eventually at some point. And I know everyone will argue when that comes into M2 and how that gets to M2, but just in my grand general thinking, it's like eventually M2 goes up faster because of that, or like
for sure. I mean, that's what happened during COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most like aggravating lies ever and obfuscations of reality. I really don't understand why the gentleman on CBC did this. Is, there was criticisms about, he said, the Bank of Canada didn't print any money.
Yeah,
I did a video on this, which you can check out on my IceCap Canadian Market Wrap, where I specifically address that claim and then attack it, because I think it was basically fucked up that the CBC basically came on and said, this politician said Bank of Canada didn't printed money. That's wrong. The language print money is a colloquialism. It is been said since Ben Bernanke in 2012, like Ben Bernanke, who was who was the Federal Reserve chairman, so the chairman of the U.S. Central Bank, who's like the grand poobah of quantitative easing. Like, he wrote his PhD thesis on it. He was the run, with his shaking glass in the Senate Banking Committee in 2008 or 9, whatever, when he said, the world is basically about to collapse and I need to step in. The language printing money is the right term. Okay. So when people say, oh, they didn't print money, no one is under the impression that they printed cash in a basement somewhere and put the cash on pallets and put the pallets in the truck and then went and sprinkled. That's not what it is.
He could deny it. Yes. Because it wasn't that.
Technically, it wasn't printing, but that is like a profound and, in my view, purposeful obfuscation of what was done. Reserves were created out of thin air, and those reserves were used to absorb the debt issuance of a government. And that is and then that is in and of itself not a bad thing. Where it becomes really, really bad is when you have 95% of the debt issuance being absorbed by the central bank that created reserves out of thin air in order to absorb that debt issuance. That's exactly what happened during COVID. And there are all kinds of knock-on effects from that, as you I'm sure have demonstrated many, many times on your channel. And so it drove me totally bonkers that he was attacking the language instead of the substantive part of that line of talking. And it's true. If you just Google money printing 2012, 2013, that is what they did. And I disagreed with it then. I disagree with it now. Your point about whether or not it will happen again, I mean, probably.
Just the numbers are getting bigger. That's why I'm hesitating. I'm like, holy smokes, if this happens again, this is...
And there's a counter argument to this, Tom. The counter argument is during COVID, we thought it was going to be a zombie apocalypse and we needed to step in to do all these things, Sure.
This is where I disagree with this is where I'm like, okay, do we have capitalism or do we not? That goes back to that for me. Yes, in 2008, because the argument is always well, Tom, do you know what would have happened if all those banks failed? And I'm like, well, what has happened because we didn't let them fail? How about we answer that question?
Well, we did actually, but in Canada specifically, we bailed out. The thing is we allowed a government to run a 10% budget deficit. And by allow, what I mean is if Justin Trudeau went to the market and said, we're going to issue all this paper to pay for people to stay at home, the interest rates on that debt would have skyrocketed to 10, 15, who knows what, maybe 5, whatever it would have. And we would have been forced from the public would have been forced to reckon with that decision here and the now. Yeah,
that's a good way to say it. I like that.
And what it did instead is it basically punished the labor class.
Yeah.
And transferred wealth to the asset holder. all of your listeners must have been very pleased that their house prices went up by 25%.
Well, I mean, we can be, you know what, as a real estate investor, you can be pleased, but you can also know that it's wrong.
Right.
Like this shouldn't be happening this way. Right. Like this is all wrong.
And so
like
the idea that they were like trying to help people by keep paying them money to stay home, you know, I don't want to relitigate COVID policy, but one of the things that was horrific was it was genuinely, like you can see it in the house price chart. The house prices jumped 25% or whatever, in some cases even higher than that over 2 years. Rents soared. Who rents? Poor people do. Who owns? Rich people do. Mm-hmm. So and we know that wages are not keeping up with your inflation. Even my inflation, we know that wages are not keeping up with. Even the most benign, right? We know.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So if you're a wage earner, you got destroyed. And it was effectively a government sanctioned transfer of wealth from working people to rich people. And I will go to my grave thinking that was an abomination. And so and it was facilitated by, and if not encouraged by, central banks. And that's fine. They thought the juice was worth the squeeze. I get it. They thought it was going to be a zombie apocalypse. Again, I don't want to relitigate that. But not every country did that. We didn't have to do that. That was a choice. That was a policy decision. And there were material and long-term impacts from that policy decision. And your point is that going to happen again? I think maybe, but not to the same degree.
Yeah. I like the way you described that, though, because because they were able to go through a central banking system to make all this work, they didn't have to reckon with the fact that if the prime minister went straight to the market and the market said, hey, to get that money, we're going to charge you 15%, it might have been different. But because you have this other mechanism in which to do all this, which the CBC didn't want to admit that they were printing money or whatever. It's like this weird way, and it punishes, I think, the very people that they should be trying to protect. But anyway, Richard, I want to be respectful of your time because I'm just thinking I would like to get his thoughts on measuring a lot of this stuff in gold. I don't know if you like measure stuff in gold when you're looking at stuff, but I just want to say something. I really value chatting with you, but more than that, I really value what you put out on Twitter and on X, the Loonie Hour podcast that you're doing. Thank you, because I really think you're speaking for a bunch of us out here who are trying to think critically about the Canadian economy. And then your data and the way you're explaining things really brings it to life and helps bring clarity. So thank you for what you're doing. I mean this very sincerely. You're one of the very few people in the country who are putting this stuff out there and talking about this stuff. So thank you. So,
well, thanks for that. I appreciate it.
No, and I want to thank you again for putting up with me, because I know I just throw like wild stuff. Nick would be like, Tom, what are you talking about? Let the poor guy speak and just shut up.
I really genuinely, and if I cut you off or if I disagreed to brash,
no,
it's only because I feel very comfortable with you.
Yeah. No, it's great. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I do as well. So thank you. So anyone listening to this, do you want to direct them to where? Sure. The YouTube channel, IceCap Asset Management?
Yes,
you tell us.
So that's the company I work for. We manage money for families all across Canada and the world. We capital preservation and dealing with the risks that some of which we've outlined today, and others which we'll cover in a webinar I think we're going to have soon. That's the company I work for. So get in touch if you're interested. I also have the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap, which is my weekly sort of vignette on different economic subjects: inflation, labor markets, exports, trade. This week, I'm going to do one on the government's budget forecast, which we didn't get a chance to talk about really, but that's a big thing. Then there's the Loonie Hour podcast, which is our weekly podcast, which is a conversation that I have with Keith Dicker, who's my boss at IceCap, and Steve Soretsky, who's just, marketing and real estate maven. And I highly recommend you give those two guys a follow as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Richard, thank you for this. Really appreciate it. Always value chatting with you. Thank you.
Cheers.